I think what my role is to sort of set up the afternoon session. So what I'm going to try to do is show you perhaps the life of a future replacement gilt, probably how she's managed in the multiplication phase, and then suggest some areas that we could probably look at or probably use to monitor how well she's actually moving through that process. With the hopes being that, along the way we could perhaps think about ways to improve that or modify that, or we might reach a point where she's past the point of no return, so we really don't need to invest too much more time in her. So I'm going to move over here because I'm right-handed. That's okay. But as a physiologist, I guess we tend to look at things a little bit differently. And so what I tend to, when I think about saw longevity, I really think about it as really three phases. One is sort of the developmental phase, and the analogy I use is that's when we build the reproductive engine of the gilt. And the other is the functional phase, and I think that's what Steve covered very nicely about how well she stays in that production cycle, how many pigs you can have, things like that. And then there's the transition phase is when we decide to breed her for the first time. Okay? And so what I'm really going to do is focus a lot of time back here, which will occur in the multiplication phase, and try to convince you that really the success or failure of that female to a great extent is being set up here. And then we can either have one that has the potential to be very productive and have longevity here. We still have to manage her very correctly in this phase as well. So the basic premise is that are there things we can measure right now, if we could collect the data, that would give us some idea of how this female would function as an adult. So what I'm going to try to do is show you some results from studies we've conducted over the years and then try to back that up with what we understand or we think we understand is physiologically happening in terms of the development of the gilt's reproductive system. And then I think both Dr. Cassidy and Dr. Ross this afternoon are going to fill you in a lot more details about specific areas within this process. And so it used to be when I was a graduate student many years ago, and it's more years than I would care to share with you. So I'll just put it this way. Right now I have, in North Carolina State, I have 7 advisees that was also their parents' advisors, so I've been there quite a while. So you're getting old when, say, my dad had you when he came here, or anything like that. So we used to think that it was when you bred the animal for the first time. And then I think we've learned since then that actually the development of her reproductive system began much earlier. What we know is that right prior to birth, it's a very active period of most, the growth and development of most organs, including the reproductive system, and that there's been good evidence that birth weight is sort of correlated with overall organ development. And I'll just share some of you that George Foxcroft put together in a really nice review article he did a couple of years ago. If you just look at organ weight here, and you look at the birth weight, you can see, and then all the major things we think about, there's a linear increase. Okay. So there's really no reason to believe that the same thing doesn't happen for reproductive organs. And people ask, why is that? And the analogy I make is that a crowded uterus is like a crowded pen. And so we know what happens to pigs, to their growth and their development and their physiological status when we crowd them in pens. Well, the same thing happens in utero. And I would argue that in our multiplication farms, when we're selecting for those highly productive females, the risk is probably greater in these females. Hence, we're going to say the replacement female stronger than it probably is in a commercial setting. So the idea is that if you have a crowded uterus, there's less room to develop. You literally stunt the growth versus if there's fewer pigs. And so we all know the inverse relationship between litter size and birth weight, and we can show that growth. So that's why physiologically that makes reasonable sense. So birth weight's probably also related to the development of the reproductive organs. Pigs are somewhat unique in that in most mammals that we think about, all the follicles they'll ever have in their life are set at birth. That's pretty much the case in pigs, but there is a little bit of development sort of directly after birth. But you can think of that ovary having most of at least the follicles and the eggs that it's ever going to have when it's born. So you can see how that phase during late gestation could impact that considerably if there's crowding and there's less development. So we have a couple of faculty members that do a lot of embryo transfer at NC State. And so they select gilts, and then they breed the gilts, and then they go in so many days later and flush embryos out to get embryonic stem cells and things like that. So they work at the unit that I'm kind of in charge of, so I make them keep all kinds of records. And when we went back, it's really kind of interesting. I went back and said, well, is there any sort of evidence that birth weight might be related to the reproductive performance in these females? So let me just tell you what happens is the gilts are normally given boar exposure about 150 days of age, and then they're probably given 2 or 3 cycles. The guys breed them. They go in 20, 30, 40 days later and flush all the embryos out or remove the fetuses. So we can get a lot of good information. They don't really care what the gilts are like as long as they'll come into heat and breed, so we get lots of variation in birth weight. So this is just some information from those type of studies. You see that we have birth weight categories here of between 2 and 2.8 pounds and then greater than 3.5 pounds. I left kind of the ones out in the middles. There's about 120 observations in each set, over a long period of time. So not done in all one day, not even 1 year. What you can tend to see that is that every indication of reproductive performance is lower in the gilts with the small birth weights as the heavy birth weights. And in many cases, these gilts are raised together in the same pen through the nursery, through the developmental stage, and they're basically bred at the same age to meet these people's needs. So that's one piece of evidence. The one that's really more convincing is I want to show you is we did a study that was a couple of years ago where we wanted to manipulate pre-weaning growth, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. But in that study, we actually basically did that by cross-fostering. So we created situations where we only picked gilts from litters of 10 to 14 born alive, and we fostered them to have small numbers or large numbers. What I'm going to show you are the birth weight categories for what we consider the control in this study. And then we followed these animals through 6 parities in the herd. So they went to different commercial farms. They were tagged at birth. We monitored them through the developmental stage. We followed them to the commercial farm. We made observations. So we do have at least some evidence in terms of how long they stayed in the herd through the 6th period. Okay. So let me show it up a little bit. These are the percentage of the females starting in that stayed in the herd. And so this is entry. So this is actually when they're eligible to breed, like Steve talked about. And then we have retrospectively split them into our birth weight categories. Now, I will tell you that about 2/3 to 70% of the gilts, those 921 gilts in that group, were within this birth weight range. And the reason is we tried to sort of eliminate birth weight in this study because we didn't want variations in birth weight. So you have about 600 to 700 in here, and then you have about, the balance split fairly evenly between the heavy pigs and the light pigs. So this isn't a real extensive data set. But again, this is their birth weight when they were born, and then this is where they ended up, how many have actually farrowed 6 litters in a commercial setting. And so you can see it's quite interesting that if they're really small pigs, they came into heat okay, but not many of them conceived after that first farrowing. So that was a drop-off in them. And if you remember back to the previous slide, the embryonic survival was very low. It was only about 60%. Ovulation rate was low in that other data set with the really small birth weight pig. So that seems to fit together as you'd expect them to not be very successful when they farrowed. You look at the medium range here, and as it was suggested earlier, where they really fall out is in that rebreeding period after their first lactation. Okay. That's the R1. And then the heavier pigs seem to function pretty well in this setting. Okay. So there's another piece of evidence, I think, that birth weight, because it probably does reflect at least the ovarian machinery that the female has to work with at that point, may be a possible physiological sort of indicator of her future success. Now, I think the challenge is we don't know, and I don't know, how that birth weight changes, and it could probably change from one operation to the other depending on how the animals are managed and things like that. In this particular farm, they utilize pen gestation, so that may have an influence on longevity versus crate gestation. But I think it is probably true And so it just makes me wonder when we go and look at females, there probably is a birth weight minimum, below which that no matter how well the female's managed after that, through the rest of the multiplication phase, and when she enters the commercial production, that she doesn't have a very good chance for longevity because she simply doesn't have the reproductive machinery as the other, because her growth and development of the ovary was stunted in utero, and that's a reflection of her birth weight. Where that benchmark is for different herds, I don't know. But we've all seen it in commercial operations on the finishing side. The smaller pigs that are born small, they stay small throughout the whole production system. And so you'd expect the same sort of thing to happen for replacement female. So that brings us to the next phase, and this is where we spent a considerable amount of time over the last probably 4 or 5 years. And I think we have some reasonably good information that's controlled, where we've tried to do exactly what Dr. Pullman said. We've tried to go into a farm, look at longevity over a long period of time, by managing animals differently in the post-weaning phase. So the reason that this would be important from a physiological perspective is that while the follicles and the eggs are in place at birth, the analogy I use is that the follicles learn how to be follicles the first 30 days of an animal's life. By that I mean there's a very rapid period of development. They begin to develop the response elements to the hormones and the growth factors they're going to respond to as adults, and so they kind of learn how to be follicles that first 30 days. And so just to show you a little bit of that, this is some work that one of our students did years ago, where he went in and took ovaries from day 1 old gilts and 21-day-old gilts, and he kind of looked at the different response elements, and there's a tremendous increase in what the follicles do and grow. And really by about day 21, those follicles, even though they're very small, they're not what you really see in an adult animal, they're really small, but they still respond to the same things that we can use to stimulate adult follicles when they're immature animals. So the response elements of the follicles develop, or at least part of it developed during that first 21 days, or when that replacement female is nursing its mother. Okay. So to go back to what we said earlier, producers probably don't have much control, if any control, over birth weight. But they can control pre-weaning growth. And so that was kind of the gist of the study that we did. What we really did was wanted to go in and create differences in pre-weaning growth rate. The idea being is that the ones that grew faster sort of pre-weaning may have greater development of the follicles, or you may develop follicles that can communicate better as adults versus the ones that had slower ones, because that's one of the key developmental periods where that happens. So we did the same sort of thing. Again, I wanted to point out, and I think this is important because I'm going to come back to it later, in this commercial farm system, it's a very large system. We started out with about 2,000 gilts. We did the fostering. And then it did use pen gestation, and the average birth weight, because it was a very productive multiplication farm, had very productive maternal female lines, the average birth weight of all these replacement gilts was less than 3 pounds, which in my estimation, that would be a small pig. So the average litter size of the multipliers in this farm was quite large. So they've done a good job selecting for increased number born alive. I think it was like close to 13.8, something like that. So very, very robust genetics in that respect. So just to show you what they look like when we're done. So here's a litter with 10 pigs nursing. There's one with 7 pigs nursing. You see, these aren't bad pigs by any means right here, but these are quite a bit larger when we weaned them about 21 days. The other thing is we did have a few pigs die for non-disease reasons, like they got their head caught in something or things like that. So we were kind of scavengers. Whenever a pig died, we picked them up and cut things out and analyzed them. And I just wanted to show you cross-sections of the ovaries. This is one from a normal-sized pig at 17 days, and this one was raised in a smaller litter. And so all these little things are follicles here. So eventually they have the potential to develop into it. But you can see in a similar cross-section how much larger these follicles are in the same age pig, just by the venture that there's probably less competition, more weight, things like that. So there is kind of a physiological basis that, again, it's the same sort of thing, at least during this stage, early on the first 30 days when we know things are happening. pretty dramatically, both anatomically and physiologically, to the ovaries and the follicles, more weight seems to be associated with greater organ development. So here's the data that probably you've seen before. This is the pigs that were raised in litters of 7 or less. These are the ones that are 10 or less, and you can see that we get a really nice separation and longevity of sows that ferret 6 parities. If we go and look at the reproductive performance, and I'll breeze through it real quickly because I want to get to something a little bit more important. We did tend to see a little bit higher farrowing rate. There was a tendency for a higher number born alive. This was actually, in their commercial farms, about where this system was, right about 84%. So we didn't bump it up too much, but it was a nice little boost that they got consistently for those females throughout the entire 6th period. So what happens is, it's kind of interesting. I think that probably what we really did was we reduced the competition. We allowed the piglets to gain more pre-weaning. There was a really good session this morning on lactation physiology and the interaction, and it was related to pre-weaning survival, but I actually took home a lot of lessons for that when I listened. And so the question is can we measure or assess growth during the pre-weaning period accurately during this development of future replacement gilts? And I don't think the answer is quite as easy as what people think. And so I'm going to show you what we did. So one of the ways to do this, and Steve showed you some of their data, is that you take things you measured, and then you look at how much of that factor played into the differences you saw and what you were interested in. In this case, we looked at how much of these different weight parameters played into how much difference we got in sow longevity 6 parities down the road. And you have to remember is we knew, or we expected to see differences because we deliberately set up the experiment to create differences in growth rate pre-weaning. Okay? So you can just look at weaning weight. A lot of people take that. The R-square is basically the percentage of that overall variation. I've added the p-values there for the statisticians and the geneticists in the room. But weaning weight was about 6%. Pre-weaning gain, so if we just took the weaning weight minus the birth weight, it was a little bit better at 14%, and it did become significant. And then we began to look at something that I called the pre-weaning gain as a ratio of the birth weight. And so I want to show you probably why that's kind of important. So let's just pretend we had 4 pigs. And what I've seen here is listed, say, theoretical characteristics of these 4 pigs. And then the things that are similar are the same colors. So you see that these pigs right here, pig A and B, have the same birth weight, and pig C and D have the same birth weight. And then we have some pigs that have the same weaning weight, but they have different birth weights. Then we can have pigs with the same pre-weaning gain, but they can have different weaning weights and different birth weights. Okay? So if you just look at those individual sort of factors, you're going to have some what we call confounding. But if you kind of express the ratio of how well they grew from where they started, and this is a ratio here, you get numbers like this. And so that might actually be the best way in this system to sort of estimate growth pre-weaning, not looking at a single characteristic, but kind of looking at it as a ratio. And I'll kind of show you why at least we think it happened in this case. So we put that in. That came in at 22%, the most significance, and this is the reason why. So if we break down what we saw in our longevity between the 2 sort of fostering strategies based on these birth weight categories that I talked to you about earlier. The less than 2.5 pounds, the 2 to 3.5 pounds, the greater than 3.5 pounds, you can see that there really wasn't much of an effect for the big pigs if they were born and then nursed in a smaller or large litter. If their birth weight was a certain size, chances are they're going to gain at a pretty good rate because they're probably going to be the dominant pigs, the most vigorous pigs, so they're going to get to the underline first. They're going to nurse more vigorously and more often. So then you begin to look at the different birth weight categories that are smaller than that. You can see that it was really with the lighter birth weights where you saw a big difference in what they did in terms of the longevity. Okay. So there's probably some pigs, and so this is probably why the birth weight and the growth sort of in that the pre-weaning growth relative to birth weight came out to be such a big impact. Because there's some group where the birth weight and the weaning weight probably doesn't make in a big sense here, in this sort of category right here, because it doesn't really matter. But here it's sort of an interaction between the birth weight and then how much you allowed them to recover, if you will, that weight they lost pre-birth, after birth, by how they nursed in the litter. And so I think in terms of looking at during that phase, I don't think the question is just as simple as looking at how fast they grew or how fast or what they weighed at weaning. It might be looking at some ratio to that effect. If other farms are like this farm in terms of how they respond. And so then if we add all that up, actually we were pretty pleased with just looking at these characteristics of growth. You know, we explained about almost half, but then the thing I remind people is that there's still quite a bit that we left unexplained that we didn't even measure in the model, and so there's still quite a bit to look at besides just this pre-weaning growth and the birth weight issue and the interaction between the two. So I do think that pre-weaning growth is important. It does occur in a pretty important time in terms of ovarian functionality. How you want to sort of measure that, I think, is up to you, but I think there are sort of positive associations with that. Now, the interesting thing is, as you can imagine, the pigs that were nursed in the smaller litters were larger at weaning, they were larger at breeding, they were larger as P1 sows, and I think probably in a system where they're pinned together in gestation pens, the larger sows have an advantage over the smaller sows when they have to compete for feed and resources and things like that. So that, you know, this might be a little bit unique to that production situation in the functional phase. Whether we'd have seen the same thing or not if they were sort of housed in crates, I don't know. If you follow the way the industry's going, that may not be all that important in the future. Who knows? So then the last part I want to talk about is, and this is some more recent work that we've played around with, so we don't really have anywhere near the definitive results yet, but we have some ideas, is that then we have this phase between weaning and breeding, which I think Steve characterized it fairly accurately. It's kind of a black box in terms of what's the best way to manage the females. But I will tell you that if we had to pick a test, if you wanted to come in and test the females for something that would be predictive during this time of how they would function in their lifetime as an adult on commercial farms, it would have to be something that mirrors or mimics what they're expected to do throughout that functional phase. The breeding, the getting pregnant, the farrowing, the lactating, and the rebreeding again, from a reproductive standpoint. And so when I look at this, it all happens to do with how well they can show estrus in response to changes that go on. So this is my cartoon that illustrates this. So this happens at puberty. It happens every time a female is weaned and we expect her to rebreed. So we give her boar exposure. The boar exposure triggers release of LH and FSH from the brain. Hopefully the ovary is responsive and grows follicles. Estrogens are produced, and then estrogen sets up this estrus, which is our cue that she's ready to be rebred in a timely fashion. So she's expected to do that at puberty. She's expected to do that from a physiological perspective every time she's weaned at some point if she stays in the herd. And if you remember what Dr. Pohlman said, is that the number one reason in their system where animals don't stay in the herd is they don't show estrus. So this mechanism right here is the physiological way that females show estrus. So I need to tell you a little bit about how we look at it. So it's kind of tricky if you think about it, because I'll tell you what we normally do, and what we normally do probably masks our ability to really figure out how well females can do that at a young age. So down here I have a timeline with the chronological age of the females, everywhere from 140 to 220. And then I have two graphs. These are frequency profiles of typically what we would see in commercial operations if we gave boar exposure at different ages. So I'll start up here, which may be fairly common. Here's a situation where we give bore exposure at 170 days of age, and then we get a nice synchronous response. And so we would break that down into having about 75, maybe 80% respond in the first 3 to 4 weeks, and then we have some that sort of tail after this. Okay? And so if we were to back up that bore exposure to a younger age, and it has some challenges, and it's really not practical on most commercial settings or most multiplication phases, we would probably get something like this. We would spread out this very synchronous response, which is actually a good thing from a management standpoint, to where we'd have some respond very early and then some sort of respond later. Okay? And so the reason that you can think about it is if we don't give bore exposure at 140 days of age, and these females down here could have responded, they'd stay in waiting and waiting and waiting, and you have a lot of more animals that could respond, and then when you hit them at 170 days of age, you get this nice synchronous response. And that's a good thing for bringing gilts into production and things like that. But it does sort of mask our ability to respond, to detect the ones that respond fairly early. So why is it important to find the ones that respond early? Well, there's two reasons, if I can back up, is that the ones that respond early can do this earlier, or they do it more efficiently. That means the ovaries can grow follicles with lower levels of LH and FSH, or the female can respond to lower levels of estrogen and act normally, so they're more efficient from a physiological standpoint. So if we go back and we look at that study that we did with sort of the large and the small litters, we actually had a component where we actually gave bore exposure at 140 days of age to a subset of animals. And we actually recorded the proportion that actually could respond early to bore exposure. Now, in this system, they let all animals sort of be bred when they were about 240 to 250 days of age. So they're given bore exposure early. The ones that came into heat were recorded, and then they weren't bred until they were about 240, 250 days of age. So what I want you to do is look at the difference between the early responders in this treatment here, 77%, and 53% for this treatment. And then I'm going to go back to the difference in longevity, okay, at the very end. So we have right around 38% here, and this one's down pretty close to about 16%. So that's 22% difference there. This is 24% difference there. So I don't think that's a coincidence, okay? And so I think that whatever we decide to do in terms of managing future replacement gilts, I think a key is going to be, can we figure out a way to find out which ones could respond early to bore exposure without really giving them bore exposure, so we can still get this synchronous response. So giving bore exposure at 140 days of age on a commercial gilt developer is a nightmare. And I can't probably repeat the words in public that, some of the problems we caused by doing this with this study. So it's not something that's practically done. It's not something that probably could be practically done in most situations. But I think if you look at the literature, there's lots of different studies that would suggest that the ability to reach puberty early, or what I say, respond to bore exposure in early age, has positive associations with all kinds of measures of reproductive performance. And these are limited data sets, but I think there's something good about females who can respond to bores early. Now, when you decide to breed that female and bring her into production, it's an entirely separate question. It's an entirely separate issue. But females that respond early are probably going to be more productive than females that can't. So one way we've played around with, it's kind of interesting, is there is a product that's approved on the market that kind of does the same thing as bore exposure. It's PG600. You can kind of think of it like this: it replaces LH and FSH, it stimulates the ovary, produces estrogen, and then you get swelling. What we've tried to do is to go into herds and use it as a test. So herds think that they're doing a good job with their gilt development. And so what we've tried to do is do a dose titration with PG600 so we get part of the estrus response, but not all of it. So what we want to do is try to cause the vulva to swell, but not get ovulation. And so we can verify vulva swelling, but just by looking at it, we can verify whether they've ovulated or not by doing real-time ultrasonography subsequently. So the idea is you could go in at a certain time, test some females, get an idea of how many could respond, and that gives you an idea of how well your gilt development program to that point has allowed you to produce gilts that can respond, at least in part, in theory, early to boar exposure. So we've done a dose titration to look at what age we could do this at. And so probably it looks like somewhere between 120 to 140 days of age. Probably we get the best sort of response when we've gone back and sort of done the same cross-fostering study, but then just looked at, if we give them PG600 these ages, how many show vulvar swelling, how many don't without ovulation. And 160 days is too late. You give a little bit of PG600 and they all swell. 80 to 100 days, 80 days definitely is too early. For most of the farms we work with, most of them take a weight on the animals about 140 days of age. They kind of get a growth phase. It's kind of an off-test weight. So that makes a really convenient time when they're in the scale just to pop them with the drug. And so we don't have any sort of hard data and how it's related to their longevity. That's being collected. But the interesting thing is that I would say that it's pretty easy to tell. Okay, so here's one that didn't respond to the PG600, right? And then here's one that did. And so then we have, of course, these are the extremes, right? We have things in between or not. But I think it does sort of have potential, if you will, to provide a way to look at what might be able to respond early to boar exposure without actually getting to do that. And that can give you a lot of sort of a check in the system. And I would argue that regardless of what we do before this period of time, if we get a female that can respond early to boar exposure, she's going to have the potential to be a very productive female and stay in the herd for a long time versus one that hasn't. There's lots of different types of studies out there that would suggest that. So I think possibly, we're not ready to do this, but it could be a way to sort of test for this using low levels of commercially available gonadotrophins and then just looking at simple how well the vulva swells. And that would still give you the flexibility then later on is to when you really wanted to expose the gilts to boars, you could still get the synchronous response, and it may be different for different situations. So to come back to the physiological sort of predictors, I do think that birth weight and weaning weight or pre-weaning growth give us some idea. And they're kind of indicators of the overall animal's development, and they occur during the same time where there's very significant things going on within the ovary that the female has to do when she's an adult. Right here, I think, is a black box, and where no more work needs to be done. I do think that regardless of however we manage gilts during this phase, if we had some way to estimate if they could respond early to boar exposure without responding, that would be a good thing. That may be the most important physiological test that we can come up with. And then how we manage them here, and then when we decide to breed them are two different questions, and it may differ for different operations. So with that, I'd like to thank lots of people. Don't do all this work by myself. The National Pork Board has been very good in sponsoring our research.